Warren is professor in the film and digital media department at UC Santa Cruz. His art projects have been exhibited in several cities of the United States and I believe in Europe. And his recent book is titled The Software Arts. It actually came out, I believe, right in the middle of COVID. And I remember inviting you, but you were busy. So finally, we can hear directly from you. The fundamental thing that I like about the book, it shows how the arts are at the core of computing. That's a very different take from what we've seen traditionally. Again, the detailed bio is at lasertalks.com. And Warren, the podium is yours.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Piero, for giving me the opportunity to present this 2019 book, The Software Arts. The pandemic inhibited me from getting the word out. That was fantastic presentation, Anastasia. I'm really excited to learn about that work. And urchins, as I was saying in the comments, are really urgent here in Northern California. So I hope you bring some of that to the West Coast. You're thinking to the West Coast as well. And I'm especially pleased to share the lectern today with Carol Strohecker, who mentioned also that we're friends from graduate school days when we had a weekly reading group, the Narrative Intelligence Reading Group at MIT. And we puzzled through some of the topics I touch on in the book. So I'm really grateful as well to speak with you all. Those of you in the audience, art and technology folk, because it's you that I wrote the book for. So let me share my screen. So I've got, oh, there we go.
I don't see it.
How about there?
Okay, now it's okay.
Okay. So in the software arts, I argue that computing grew out of the arts. The stakes of the book are threefold: pedagogical, industrial, and epistemological. So if software is an art, then education needs to change to integrate it into the arts. What do we teach? What do we learn? These are old questions that need to be posed again in a world where basic literacy is not only a matter of Latin, Greek, or English, but also of software. Second, if software can be written in the manner of an artist humanist, then new avenues of software production beyond engineering and science may be possible. Third, if software is the new lingua franca, then there are a series of ethical and moral questions that must be pursued in conjunction with this epistemological transformation. Specifically, what counts as knowledge, for whom, and at what cost? So my focus today is on chapter 3, language. There's the table of contents. And the language that I'm concerned with is literally and metaphorically the language of cookbooks and other how-to manuals. This kind of language ties the origins of computing with the arts. In the 17th century, artificial philosophical languages were proposed to knit together the liberal arts, logic, grammar, rhetoric. Those are all liberal arts of language. And the mechanical arts, like those practiced by artisans in workshops producing pins, stockings, locks, guns, and jewelry. So when the writings of the mechanical arts are cookbooks, the descriptions are recipes. And when they're not cookbooks, they are how-to manuals with metaphorical recipes explaining step-by-step how things are made. The language of the literal and metaphorical recipes, these artificial languages, became what we know today as computer programming languages. So the claim is that contemporary artificial languages have shaped and been shaped by the arts. In the chapter, I argue that computers are not information technologies, and the operations of computing are not the functions of mathematics. To expand on these assertions, I tell a history of programming languages that starts in the artisans' workshops of 18th century France. I trace a history of the division of labor as it was conducted in these studios and workshops, as it was transcribed by the economist Adam Smith in the first chapter of his book, The Wealth of Nations, as Gaspard Prony revised Smith to organize large-scale calculations with human computers for post-revolutionary France, and as Charles Babbage devised a machine to embody Prony's methods in his analytic engine. Ada Lovelace, who used the operations of the analytic engine to write the first computer program in 1843, called this a science of operations and contrasted it with mathematical logic. So I define work language to mean the language, the text and talk, describing the processes and products of work performed by people. So for instance, one might scrutinize Benjamin Franklin's writings. That's interesting. One might scrutinize Benjamin Franklin's writings about work, early to bed and early to rise, make a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, in order to argue that contemporary business practices, as seen in documents of corporate mission, of legal contracts, of legislation, employee manuals, and so forth, are still tied to Protestant ethics in a variety of ways. Each age, each culture, each industry, each economy has one or more work languages. So analogously, I define machine language to mean the language, specifically text, describing the processes and products of work to be done by machines. Machine languages are used to design and analyze machines. To adequately describe how a machine works is tantamount to writing a step-by-step recipe for the work to be done. And when a machine is designed to replace a human in a work process, the actions performed by the human must be translated into a machine language. The work language of information I'm sorry, I'm having a little problem with those slides there. The work language of information is a language of calculation and mathematical functions developed in the 18th century by a network of Enlightenment engineers, scientists, philosophers, economists. And the work language of information was used to translate the work of men and machines into heat or electrical charge. And thus we have the quantitative measures of the watt, the joule, the coulomb still used today. So the French fortifications engineer Charles Augustin de Coulomb stated at the beginning of his 1775 treatise what he took to be the fundamental unit of work. He uses this unit to compare the work of machines and the work of men, and he says, we have just seen that the effect of a machine can always be measured according to a weight multiplied by the height to which it's been raised. It's sometimes called a foot-pound. This measure of work, weight multiplied by the height to which it is raised, is still central to contemporary physics and structural engineering. It reduces what might be a set of very complicated movements to a single number labeled with a unit, specifically the unit of foot-pounds. So the formalization of this language is defined in the unit of work named for the following generations, 19th century generations, James Prescott Joule, an English scientist and beer brewer, by the respective eponymous units, units named after this network of scientists, mathematicians, and engineers. The definition of a joule relates together many of the participants of the work network I listed. 1 joule usually written as J, is a unit of work equal to the expenditure of energy necessary to apply 1 Newton, that is to accelerate 1 kilogram of mass at a rate of 1 meter per second squared through a distance of 1 meter. Alternatively, a joule can be defined as passing an electric current of 1 ampere, that is 1 coulomb per second, through a resistance of 1 ohm for 1 second, or we can understand a joule to be the heat required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 0.24 Kelvin, a measure of temperature named after the British physicist and engineer Lord Kelvin. And this definition can be written as an algebraic equation. The equation does far more than Coulomb's sentences of 1775. The equation succinctly relates not just weight and height, but also heat and electricity, mechanics, thermodynamics, and electrodynamics, and many of the fluxes and flows investigated independently in the 18th century. So this line of research was continued through the 19th century as thermodynamics with a practical application to, among other things, Joule's business of brewing beer and the construction of steam engines, and then eventually internal combustion engines. The unit of 1 joule divided by Kelvin, that is a measure of work or energy, divided by temperature, turned out to be pivotal for the development of thermodynamics. J over K is the unit of entropy, the measure of disorder. Entropy is a measure of the number of ways in which a system may be arranged. That is, its measurement in a system is proportional to the number of possible states of the system. Now, in the middle of the 20th century, Claude Shannon created a formal definition of information based on the definition of entropy. And according to Shannon, entropy is equal to the average amount of information contained in a message. So this definition of information has its origins in the 18th century problem of measuring how much work a common laborer accomplishes lifting and carrying loads at a construction site. And this we know today as the basis for information theory, but this work language is emphatically not the basis of computing, despite the fact that we commonly call computers information technologies. So many students who've taken introductory physics have been struck by the absurdity of this work language. Let's revisit the construction site, but this time with the artisans and not with the manual laborers. Imagine you are a house builder's apprentice and your name is Sisyphus. In the morning, your duty is to take the builder's toolbox out of the truck to open it up. The builder climbs to the second floor of the house under construction. Whenever he calls out for a tool, Sisyphus, bring me a hammer. Your job is to get it out of the toolbox, climb the ladder, give it to him, wait until he finishes the task he needed the tool for, and then to climb down the ladder again and put the tool back in the toolbox. So according to this definition of work, at the end of the workday, if you've performed your job well and returned all of the tools back to the box, you have done no work, right? No foot-pounds have been accomplished. You lifted certain weights in the form of tools to certain heights at the top of the ladder, that constitutes work. But you return those same weights back to the toolbox on the ground, that constitutes negative work. Therefore, the sum total completed by you is 0. Poor Sisyphus. Anticipating my conclusions for today, let's look at the plates from Diderot's encyclopedia depicting the work of artisan pin makers. And these are the images that I started with. So just take a look at the pictures, especially not the pieces of the machinery, but the workshop in it as it's bustling along there. So do you see men and machines lifting a lot of weight? No, right? So even if the work language of physics and information is the right one for describing coal mining and construction sites, it's not the right one for describing the work of the mechanical arts. In fact, it's absurd when employed in the pin maker's workshop. So what is the appropriate work language for describing what artists, designers, and craftspeople do? There is a second work language developed in the 18th century, and curiously, this history starts at the same place with some of the same people as the history of the jewel. However, the second work language is a language of the arts. Unlike the first language, the second does not ultimately collapse into a single number representing foot-pounds. Rather, this work language can be employed to describe how work is done and not just its effects. The second language anticipates what we know today as computer programming languages. So its history is referred to within the discipline of computer science, but rarely told in full. For example, one of the founders of the field of computer science, Herbert Simon, quipped in 1958 that, quote, physicists and engineers had little to do with the invention of the digital computer. The real inventor was the economist Adam Smith. So what's Simon referring to? Recall that Adam Smith's best-known work, The Wealth of Nations, opens with an examination of the division of labor. In his quip, Herbert Simon was suggesting that we examine how work and the division of labor are at the core of the computer. The central illustration of the division of labor Adam Smith employs in Book 1, Chapter 1, is the production of pins, an illustration he took from his reading of the French encyclopedia. Smith's description, I want to point out, is in an entirely different kind of language than the first work language I just described. Adam Smith's work language has its beginnings in a set of drawings detailing a workshop producing pins in a little town in Normandy, L'Aigle, France. So it's the engineer Jean-Rudolph Perronnet who did the original observational work at this site. He was appointed the chief engineer for the district and was primarily concerned with the construction and paving of roads. But during the same period, he studied the workshops of artisans and craftsmen. He wrote 2 manuscripts on the manufacture of pins by this workshop in the nearby town of L'Aigle. While neither of these manuscripts was immediately published, Perronnet distributed the entry for pin to Diderot and d'Alembert's encyclopedia. Moreover, Perronnet's detailed descriptions of how the craftsmen produced the pins, how they used their machines, how the machines were designed, anticipated the work language and the machine language of the encyclopedia, a collection that incorporated many articles on contemporary methods of craft and production. The design historian Antoine Picon discusses the 3 main terms of this work language of the encyclopedia: gestures, operations, and processes. Picon says the common threads that connect the different articles devoted to the arts and crafts are the description of elementary gestures of production, how these movements are integrated and thereby define aggregate technical operations, and the logic of chaining together these operations to form processes organized according to a division of labor. Gestures, operations, processes. This triad was applied to the description of the fabrication of stockings, pins, or ropes, the extraction of iron ore and its refinement. The notion of operation occupies a central position in this framework. It is a kind of basic semantic unit that underlies the know-how of individuals and the logic of the entire chain of production. From individual movement to process chain, the thread that weaves them together is analogous to the overall aim of Diderot, d'Alembert, and the encyclopedia collaborators. That is, the integration of all forms of knowledge. End of quote from Picon. So Adam Smith took his opening illustration of the division of labor from his reading of d'Alembert and Diderot's encyclopedia. And then just a few years later, in 1791, Gaspard Prony, charged by the French government to produce a set of enormous and detailed logarithmic and trigonometric tables, borrowed back from Adam Smith this image of the division of labor, claiming that, quote, he could manufacture logarithms as easily as one manufacturer's pins. Now, Prony organized a great number of working class non-mathematicians, in fact, a lot of artisans, people who specialize in cutting hair and hairdressers, to perform as a set of computers in order to calculate the tables. So we need to remember that computer was the title of a job that humans performed for centuries before computer was ever a machine. A few years after Prony's achievement, British mathematician, philosopher, and engineer Charles Babbage noted how Prony's division of labor could be incorporated as a machine. Babbage translated the work language of the encyclopedia into a machine language. And on the drawing board, one can see that the machine language he forged out of the encyclopedia's work language is from a very different family than logic or mathematics. In Babbage's design, operations were also central as in the encyclopedia. Ada Lovelace, the English mathematician who published the world's first computer program in 1843, elucidated the differences between the operations of Babbage's machine and functions of arithmetic and calculus. She argued that Babbage's machine would require a new field of research beyond mathematics, a field she called a science of operations. So the first language I described, the work language of Coulomb and so forth, that ends up becoming the language of information, is a language of functions, of calculation, and now, since the 20th century, of information. The second language of the encyclopedia and its offspring is a language of operations. Research in art and design is an issue of revising and extending operations, because art and design is expressed in practice in a work language of operations and not of mathematical functions. But something of the work language of operations was lost as it was translated eventually into the terms of computing through the centuries, from Perronnet to Smith to Prony to Babbage, and then to von Neumann and Goldstein. What was lost in translation was the facility to include people, or more specifically, what was lost in translation was the facility to include people, or more specifically, what was lost in translation was the interactions between people and machines. These then are grand challenges for art and design research under computational conditions. How do we put people back into the picture? And how do we reshape the language of operations to include interactions? Thank you.
I always forget to unmute myself. Yeah, great presentation. Thank you. So, of course, there's a number of claims you made that probably surprised many people. They even surprised me, even if I'm a strong believer of the influence of the arts on technology. What are the most common criticism that you have been getting from readers and peers?
It's interesting because there are so many really prominent computer scientists who think of computer science not as a science but as an art. So Donald Knuth, his professorship at Stanford is called Professor of the Art of Computer Programming. If you went to any of the Apple technology launches when Steve Jobs was still alive, he always said it was the blend of the arts, the humanities, and technology that was more or less the secret sauce, the thing that made Apple great. So, and he described his own designers as artists. So it's rarely the computer scientists that give me the pushback. The people who I make the most nervous about this are oftentimes people in, for example, the digital humanities, who feel that anticipating some kind of pushback from computer scientists say, don't say that because you'll just make the computer scientists angry. But if I talk to the computer scientists directly, that's not the reception I get at all. You know, the most high profile computer science venue where I've presented this was as a keynote for one of the main programming language design conference, which is called OOPSLA. It's for object-oriented programming. And, you know, I was just astounded to get invited to do a keynote there. So the pushback is often from people who, I guess, I mean, I don't know what their intentions are, but I wrote the book for my students who oftentimes, I teach programming to art students frequently. And I wanted to be able to tell the story to them that shows how computing is not this other thing, but actually something that grew out of the studios. And the pushback that I get, if I'm allowed to infer what other people's intentions are, is, you know, it's for people who really don't want that to be growing out of their backyard. They want it to be someone else's business.
Yeah, I also have the perception that most computer scientists, if not all, feel good if you tell them you're an artist,
Yeah,
not just a scientist. I would expect more the people in the history of science, history of technology field, who tend to like straight lines, you know, when they describe the evolution of a new technology and science. So when I discuss with these people about the influence of the arts in general, on science, even on physics and so on, that's usually when I get the pushback. So your book, in my opinion, is an important contribution, not only specifically in your specific field, but in general, because we should focus more on the impact that the arts have on the evolution of many things, and in particular in the Bay Area. Before Silicon Valley, the Bay Area was famous mostly for crazy minds, not for great technology companies. Then out of the blue, it becomes the center of technological innovation. Not Detroit, not Stuttgart, not Torino, but crazy Bay Area. So there's a lot of clues that the arts are important in general in the development of technology and science. So I think your book is good because it narrows down one area and shows a lot of evidence.
well, here we've got Carlo saying in the chat, doing good science is an art. And so Carlo, who's unequivocally an artist, he's a sculptor and a computer scientist, I think knows this intuitively, directly. And with respect to the history of science, I found after writing the book that I seem to be unconsciously participating in a new kind of history of science that pays more and more attention to the artists and the craftsmen, especially in the laboratories. You know, who blew the glass to make the telescope? Who made this instrument? Who made that? That is sort of blowing up in the history of science, where people are spending more and more attention to recovering these figures who were really the artisans and the craftsmen working with the scientists at the time, and making it clear that, you know, that side of things is really important. And then, you know, there's also just a completely different way to tell this story that others have worked on. I don't have the Jacquard loom in here, But if you bring weaving into this, this makes it even a stronger story of how, the punch cards that Babbage used were first developed for weaving, and how weaving and computing sort of emerged together. And there's others who've done that work. So I feel it's it's participating in a certain strain, a certain school of thought in the history of science.
Yeah, and also exchanging knowledge and practical knowledge sometimes. Anyway, you have 2 more questions in the chat. You want to read them yourself?
So I've got, I wonder if the French ordinateur versus the English computer would allow people to feel more comfortable with the arts in software programming. I think ordinateur, which has a root with ordiner, to organize, to order things, is it's apt that way. But when I give this talk in France, it also brings people up short, because the kind of common knowledge, we talk about information technologies, they talk about numeric technologies, technologie numérique. And the story that I tell really is language-based rather than number-based. And that is kind of shouting in the face of common sense in French sometimes. So I sometimes hit some bumps in the road with that. But I think, yes, ordinateur is good. And then Andrew Yang asks, in terms of re-including people in such interactions, as per your final slide, how do you think the increasing advancement, ubiquity of AI has hindered or augmented this re-inclusion? What implications might a self-programming, self-replicating machine AI have for the role of people in work or innovation? So it's, it gets back to questions that were really posed in the early 60s. Should we be trying to build things that are augmentations to the human, or should we be trying to replace or automate humans? And these are, the former really we still see very much as a blooming field of human-computer interaction and so forth. But this is a constant push. And just to take a really banal design artifact, Gmail out of Google, increasingly they want to automate like how I respond and how I categorize my messages, things like that. And I just think that's a kind of push of automation that would be better to be abandoned. The better direction, design direction, would be, well, how do we help people compose messages, not how do we write the messages for them? And that it's a different mindset, right? So I think with the whole idea of AI, we've reached a point where we don't really care if the AI works or doesn't work. We just want whatever it is to work. We just want it. We just want it, right? So one thing we want is self-driving cars, and all these crashes that Tesla has been through in the last few weeks show that it really doesn't work. You can't call it automated driving. Most of the really serious people in that area of AI, of self-driving vehicles, know that it's not happening tomorrow. It's going to happen maybe in decades from now. And yet there's an audience right now who really wants it to work right now. So I think AI really stands in for, we've got whole new techniques, right, that are supported by NVIDIA and other folks who are making completely different chips for these new techniques of AI. But AI as a kind of ideology is like, let's automate everything. Let's let it handle all my email. Let's let it drive my car. And from a design perspective, the alternative is to say, well, how can we design things that really keep people in the picture?
I wonder on this one, I wonder if Carol has any comment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm appreciating this. It's a way of thinking about systems design that I haven't been involved in for many years. So I'm enjoying remembering Warren's perspectives on things, and, you know, certainly an artistic approach to making, you know, is consistent with those things I remember. I see a lot of the comments in the chat about how essential that is, and not surprising that is, as a root of the art and craft of computer programming and so on. The human in the loop makes sense to me. It's a human study, you know, then we have to know as much about those people as we can, as we do about the machines. So it's enormously more complicated to design that way. It's difficult and it's hard to get that right too, but maybe it's less risky because the human can think on the fly and do some things to recover if things start to go wrong. Just some thoughts.
And
to bring this back to this question that Piero asked you about big data, Carol, I think, you know, if you go to the big Silicon Valley firms right now, a lot of the design isn't design anymore. It's A/B testing. Like people change, they do a little kind of twiddle. They run it at, you know, 10,000 people here and 10,000 people there and 10,000 there, and they decide, oh, okay, that color pink, right? They're not really designing anymore. As we know, art and design, they're just twiddling. And so this big data is seen as a way to both, well, I would, you know, people see it as engaging lots of people, seeing what they like better. But on the other hand, it's a very shallow engagement, right? It's just whether or not you, let's say, spend more time on Netflix, not how did you like that film? And that sort of A/B testing has replaced design.
And then the effect is homogenizing.
Right. Or, I mean, the other side of it is, well, everybody has their own personal version of Netflix, but I mean, really, it's not that different.
Okay, excellent. I think the next question is for me. As a side question about laser, are there plans for last festival? So the last festival was a weekend long sort of greatest hits of the lasers, where we had 10, 12 scientists speak, and then we had a physical exhibition of art, tech inspired art. And we were going to do one in April 2019, and then everybody knows what happened. We had the venue, we had the curator, we had the budget, but then COVID came. And since then, we have been thinking about doing it online or how to do it. So if anybody has ideas about this, well, contact me. The thing is on hold right now. Okay, that said, anybody's final comment? Or maybe it's a time to wrap up and go have dinner. Okay, thank you. Thank you, presenters. These were 3 fascinating presentations. I hope Carol and Anastasia are hired by somebody in the Bay Area so we can interact more often with them.
That would be great. We're already talking about collaborating, so maybe we'll move the show to California. That'd be great.
Excellent.
Sounds good.
Okay, if you want to see the future, the next laser is on September 29. Anyway, don't trust my memory, go to lasertalks.com and you'll see the program for September, October, November, and December. We didn't have lasers during the summer. I wasn't sure if we were going back physical or not. We are not. We'll be on Zoom. And so then I started inviting again speakers from outside the Bay Area. That's really the plus of doing on Zoom. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Piero. Thank you,
very
everybody.
much.
Thank you.